As Game of the Year contenders are punted out left and right, and all new game announcements are happening like crazy right now especially, I find myself always looking for a short and sweet game to play. This time it's been Ravenlok. Released May 4th of 2023 and developed and self-published by Coco Cucumber, a really cool developer name by the way, Ravenlok is currently exclusive to the Xbox and PC platforms, and with the option to play on Game Pass as well. Now for $29.99 US, you are offered about 4 to 5 hours of playtime with little to no replay value, and you can very easily get 100% in that time as well. Now, based off of these need-to-knows alone, I already know that some people are checking out due to the short length of the game. But I promise there's a lot more nuance to that, in my personal opinion, that I think that whether it be the developer hearing this or someone who's interested in playing the game, that I think it really is worth hearing. But with that being said, I want to break this down into my usual core 4 categories, starting with the story, and then I want to go to the audio, the visuals, and then finally the gameplay. Now, the story of Ravenlok is one that you've heard before. Without spoiling specifics, you play as a girl who moves with her family away from all of her friends. After settling in and voicing your concerns of no companionship, you are teleported to a new world that reminds you a lot of Wonderland. You're greeted by all kinds of forest creatures who decorate your story as you live up to their local legend of Ravenlok. You'll embark on a quest to confront evil that plagues the land, and in doing so, you'll meet many friends and foes. And that's pretty much the main gist of the story, and personally, I think the message of the story is nice and quite clear once you actually complete and look back. And while I do like that overall, and I can look back at that and say, that was cute and sweet, I have to say that throughout the actual plot of the story, it wasn't like I was hankering to get to the next story moment. It definitely wasn't that kind of game. It felt more of like an experience than one that was like, I really need to see this story through, you know what I mean? But one thing that I need to emphasize is the charm in the small interactions. A mouse trying to trade specific objects for cheese, you can help a couple open up a shop that you can actually use later in the game, and even finding firewood to help the animate cauldron be able to brew and sell potions are all great examples earlier on in the game of this. And in these interactions with these characters and throughout the whole story, that's unfortunately where comes my biggest issue. The delivery of the game story is one of its biggest fumbles, narratively speaking. Dialogue is presented entirely through text, and while that gets the job done, don't get me wrong, it didn't feel as well as it did in a game that also had no voice acting, such as Signalis. Now, I'm not sure why it didn't work here, where otherwise it would have for me, but I'm not so disillusioned to the point where I don't see this as probably budgetary reasoning. Now, I can only just voice my own opinion here, but for as much as I like to complain about stupid little things like that obviously don't break the game, I must say that Ravenlok features one of those moments in gaming that I truly love. It perfectly wraps up its story in a culmination of experiences and characters that you've met along the way, in such a way that genuinely raised my attitude about the entire game in its final moments. Another game, for comparison's sake here, that did a really good job of this as well, that of recent memory, is The Forgotten City with one of its main endings. At the end of the day, though, Ravenlok's story has a pretty simple premise, and the hero's journey is one we've seen countless times before. However, the charm of the small interactions that come together in the final moments of the game are just enough for me, in my eyes, to offset some of the less agreeable text presentation. Now, normally here is where I would want to tackle the gameplay in my reviews, but for right now, I'd like to go right over to the audio and the visuals. And starting with the audio, the sound design for Ravenlok is a constant battle for quality, unfortunately. For every moment that I'm thinking that something is great, there is something just as bad to tip the scales back to a neutral. For instance, a small annoyance to me is that the sound effects in the main menus, which, granted, if you play the game in one sitting, I guess you don't have to do too much of it, they're pretty annoying. I don't like the sound effects. I guess I'll play them here, I'm sure. However, for all of the bad UX sounds that there may be, every other interactive sound effect within the game, like the sword slashes, pots breaking, and enemies groaning, are all serviceable and fill their role well. Now, the same push and pull is present on a much larger scale too. The soundtrack, as you move from one environment to the next, is really well done. Ranging from cute to foreboding, there's always a sense of wonder that I feel that helps the game's tone and atmosphere. My only small gripe is that transitions from one track to the next as you zip around the map are a little jarring at times, so it's really unfortunate that that's how that goes. The boss fight music is also really, really good, and it's really interesting when like you just kill them and then it like just drops off. It's so funny. But as I said that there is a push and pull of quality, and as great as the music may be, there's no ignoring that there is no voice acting in Ravenlok. Once again, I'm not trying to harp on this for the entire review. I just wanted to follow up with the audio section after the story because this was something that really put me off with this game. But the reason, once again, that I want to follow it up here is I actually have an interesting thought. Rare, I know, but what I wanted to say was that, and while I don't think that you need voice acting in games, however, I do believe that in this case it negatively impacts the whimsical tone that the game is going for. Perhaps a middle ground could have been met with a narrator like Bramble the Mountain King, a game I reviewed, where there the characters wouldn't have their own distinct voices with different voice actors, multiple lines, or anything like that, but rather that they would be paraphrased by one voice actress as if they were being quoted within a storybook, and it was super charming. While I'm not sure if that was even feasible with the approach or not, and I'm sure that there probably in the long term would have been some effect on those small character interactions I mentioned earlier, I do think it would be interesting to see the alternate reality where Ravenlok had a narrator rather than individual, text dialogues. And to me, the best side dish to go along with the audio design is, of course, the visuals, and I'll be tackling the performance here as well. There's really no way to say that Ravenlok is a beautiful game other than to just say it. The clearly distinctive art style with the pixelated details on the already voxel models is truly spectacular. The light voxel blocky art direction for the game is great. It reads super well in all environments, and since it's all matching, there is really no dips in quality of textures as they all are pretty consistent within the visual identity of Ravenlok. And while I love those voxels, the other part of the game that really stands out to me visually are the skyboxes. The hand-painted look really lends to the idea that this is your storybook Wonderland. Not to mention that they are so pretty, and they add so much context to whatever small environment you're actually in the foreground, and they kind of show you where you're heading. One of the game's best elements are the beautiful environments with tons of details. Boxes strewn across the house as you're unpacking, the giant food at the tea party, and even all of the potions and the cauldrons of the witch's hut are all great examples of dense but readable environments. Even better, Ravenlok is really colorful. The arid and warm farm, the dim giant mushroom forest, and the bright and foreboding Queen's Palace are just some of the examples of different visuals that you will experience. As you slam your way through each of the biomes, you're treated to tons of different camera angles and interesting scenes. The enemy designs are also fantastic. Each type looks unique and visually distinct enough that I can always tell what moves they would make. If that actually mattered, that is. Carrying this even further with the animations, while repetitive, they do strike me as pristine. Each attack is telegraphed well, player movement feels great, and most importantly, the small effects in the world all clean the game up from good visually to absolutely phenomenal. As for the game's performance, there are very little settings to tweak with it. However, the game ran at max settings and never once dipped in frames, and console runs absolutely great as well. Now, as for bugs, one thing that I did want to say was that while playing on PC, which is where the bulk of my playthrough was, there was one bug I had, and mind you, I had no other issues throughout the entire game, but this one bug was basically game-breaking to a degree, I guess. It was a hard crash as I went through a door. It was, often repeatable. It was the same door every time, and I could not progress the main story. However, thankfully, I was able to uninstall the game and do a fresh install, still pick up my save from the cloud, and continue the game as is without having to go back or anything, because there are no save slots like that, or, save states, I guess. So while it was fairly annoying overall, I'm thankful that the game is only 3.7 gigabytes on PC, so it was no big deal. Now, the audio and visuals especially, in my opinion, are fairly charming and a great complement to the rest of the game. And that brings us to the meat of the game, in my opinion, the play. Ravenlok features a few different gameplay loops. There's the combat loop that of course gains experience and currency from fighting foes that then gets poured into items and bettering the player. Then there's also the adventure and puzzle aspects of the game, an almost point-and-click game or Resident Evil style sense of progression where you need a lever or a key to open certain ways forward. The game is paced in such a way that you're bouncing around from one place to the next, trying to pull at different threads of narrative, for the key items that you need to progress forward. But never too much so to where it's overwhelming, especially, of course, with the runtime that we have. And it's just enough for these to make you feel smart. Then, of course, there are puzzles which range from something as simple as placing items in the right place, activating objects in the right order, or even figuring out that you need to count certain details within the environment. To me, this game isn't a puzzle game by any means, so it's forgivable, but that they're not always super engaging, though they do at the very least make you turn on your brain and maybe do a little bit of memorization. One puzzle I did not like that were in a few instances within the game were the stealth sections. The basic idea is that you walk around an environment where an AI patrols while you are trying to complete a task without being seen. The enemies are not aggressive in their vision cones in their attempts to find you, and they don't even reset whatever objective you're trying to do when they find you. And this all contributes to the mechanic feeling super half-baked, and you could tell that they didn't want to put too much of an emphasis on it. But speaking of AI trying to find you, circling back to the combat though, I think Ravenlok falls a little flat in this department. Don't get me wrong, there's definitely some appeal to the progression with upgrades or even the new abilities you unlock periodically. But the game very quickly loses any challenge once the player simply becomes accustomed to the actual combat systems, which are simply dodge or block attacks that you will follow up with some hack and slash style attacking, and that's about it. It gets really repetitive very quickly with little change-ups. The abilities that you will unlock throughout the course of the game help a bit in this, though eventually after you have all 4, you can spam them and clear out whole rooms of combat encounters, making the game once again fairly easy. Ultimately, the combat is only truly saved by the variety of enemies. As I've already said, there are quite a few visual differences, but this also translates into different combat experiences, especially in the open levels. The boss fights, while visually distinct, usually have the same idea to survive until your window to attack is open. So to me, the boss fights, once again, visually are incredible. However, the fights themselves are pretty trivial in comparison because there's usually not a lot of enemies or gimmicks to keep you at bay. Ultimately, the gameplay for Ravenlok is saved by the length of your whole experience. Being around 4 hours, the game never asks too much of the player. The challenge of combat doesn't require mastery and the puzzles won't rack your brain for hours, but that's okay. There was a clear emphasis on the atmosphere trying to be replicated in this storybook that the gameplay feels more like a vehicle rather than what was meant to keep the player completely engaged. That is just unfortunate, as I believe that this would have been a much more poignant experience if the game was just as challenging as it was, visually appealing or at least striking. But as I've already went over all of my core topics, I want to kind of break this down into a final verdict. Ravenlok is like that girlfriend that's kind of sort of completely out of your league. A cute soundtrack and strong visual flair make it really nice to look at, and the experience is definitely worth having at least one time. Unfortunately, there are definitely some downsides. Even great boss designs and enemy animations can't save the dry gameplay as far as repetitive combat and simple puzzles are only really truly manageable given the game's shorter length. Any more than that and they truly would have hurt the experience. The story almost falls flat as far as presentation is concerned, resulting in the minimal player agency with their noble quest. However, I'd be lying if I didn't say that these small character moments didn't shine through and make the experience somewhat fulfilling. Ultimately, Ravenlok isn't a game I'd recommend at full price, but I would pay for, a month of Game Pass with its equivalent of about $15 if you are buying the game. But really, that's it for me. My name is Falling Hertz. I do reviews like this. I do news videos on games. And I do Pop Corner, my pop culture podcast where we usually talk about movies, but occasionally we're going to talk about games too. But thank you so much for watching and, consider subscribing, whatever, blah, 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 YouTuber, goodbye, haha.